Okay, our speaker today is Lieutenant General Carol Nutter, and some of this will be a repeat from the last time she was here, but we should go over it again because Carol Nutter has served for over 31 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, attaining the rank of Lieutenant General with 3 stars. Her military experience included leadership positions in logistics, data processing, financial management, and research and development and acquisition. And as a purchaser of equipment and spare parts for the Marine Corps, she was subjected to industrial policy, what she'll be talking about today, and especially the edict to buy American, and also supporting equipment in Okinawa, Japan, meant dealing with long and precarious supply chains. We would have some of that nowadays too. Carol is actively serving and supporting 3 veterans organizations, 3 women's organizations, in addition to the Mid-North Shepherd Center, and we're very grateful for what she does for us at the Mid-North Shepherd Center. So please help me welcome Carol Nutter.
Thank you, Charlie. And that's a good reminder. I hear a phone. Please mute your phones, if you will. And I'm going to ask that they turn on the video first, and we'll watch the video, and then I'll make a few comments after that.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Great Decisions 2022, a 9 lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Today's Great Decisions challenge is industrial policy. We have 3 main considerations before thinking about U.S. foreign policy options. First of all, let's consider what exactly is industrial policy. We then look at the supply chain crisis, followed by economic policies. We begin with industrial policy. This is when a government identifies a critically important industry that it would like to preserve, protect, promote, or perhaps even establish. And it does so for national security or economic competitive reasons. The government then uses the power at its disposal to support and or sustain those identified industries. What sorts of options do governments have to support critically important industries? Subsidizing is one of the most popular. This is a direct payment, financial support for the industry to guarantee that it can remain competitive and stay in business. Tariffs can be placed on foreign products that otherwise would compete with the industry. Those tariffs are taxes that raise the price of foreign goods and make American-produced goods more competitive. Restrictive legislation on what can enter the country, or simply using tax policy to the advantage of select industries. What sorts of industries are supported by the U.S. government? The first category would be underlying or foundational industries, the sorts of industries upon which other industries, businesses, and livelihoods depend. National defense is a pretty obvious industry that any government would want to preserve and protect. And then finally, as we've seen more recently, in times of healthcare crises, such as a global pandemic, the medical industries must be shielded and promoted. The question, however, is when are we crossing the line? We have a pretty good sense of what capitalist economic philosophy is, beginning with Adam Smith in 1776 and moving forward. Far too often people assume that capitalism does not believe in government. That would be Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, among her many classics, in which she argued government is almost always intrusive and in the way, and that capitalism can only exist in a pure form if there is no government at all. Reading Adam Smith, it is clear that government is necessary. Someone has to write the rules of economic engagement, enforce contracts that are violated, and yes, provide support for the general population, for example, through national defense. Or perhaps these foundational industries, and I think everyone can agree that if there is an immediate health crisis, government intervention on behalf of certain industries does indeed serve the whole without violating the basic principles of capitalism. But what is outside the bounds? At what point are we no longer functioning like a capitalist economy? What sorts of industries should never be supported by the government if that government is to preserve our capitalist integrity? Certainly, any of those that are supported for purely political interest would be outside the bounds of acceptability. Maybe the supply chain crisis that we are currently experiencing, which is to a large extent a matter of convenience for American consumers. Let's then look at that supply chain situation. The goods that we buy are produced locally and internationally, although increasingly Americans are purchasing foreign goods. Widgets and gidgets, as the old economic books used to call products. They come to our shores from somewhere else. And of course, they don't originate there. There is a massive global supply chain of producers, assemblers, designers. The raw materials come from one location, they move to another one, probably in another country, for initial manufacturing, and they make their way through the system. We can find the point of origin, we can trace every single product all the way through the global system until it makes its way to its destination. And of course, this is a gross simplification of what the global supply chain really looks like, because each of those mid-destination points is also where other parts of the product are going to arrive. The leading economic philosophy today is called just-in-time strategy. You want the pieces to arrive just in time for assembly so the increasingly finished product can move to its next point of production. Because of that, if there is a disruption anywhere in the system, it could be an armed conflict among nations, it could be a global pandemic, it could be an earthquake or hurricane, it could be a new government just changing policy. It has profound implications throughout the global supply chain. The so-called ripple effect creates massive disruptions in the arrival of goods. That is what we've experienced in the last 2 years. One reason there is a global supply chain is because we purchase more and more of our products from abroad. Maybe part of the product or the entire product is assembled, manufactured, packaged, and shipped from across boundaries. If we go back in time, just a few generations, overwhelmingly Americans purchased and consumed American supplied goods. Made in America meant something, and America was a country that was largely self-sufficient. But over time, as you can see from this graph, the portion of the things that we consume that are made abroad has increased. Also, the volume of what we have consumed, what we purchased, has increased. So today, a majority of the items that we find in local stores are manufactured abroad. That makes us highly vulnerable to any disruptions in the global supply chain. Trade deals are a very big reason for that. The globalization of liberal economic policies, and by liberal I mean capitalism and free trade. If we look at the rise of free trade agreements, bilateral, regional, and international, they align pretty closely with the foreign origin of supplies. The broader we place this global trading network, the more local economies can provide material, labor, sourcing, and production of the goods that we consume. Manufacturing here in the United States, as a result, has been in severe decline. And that is something that we see throughout the Western world. It is the maturation of societies and economies. We evolved from an subsistence economy, to a self-sustaining industrial society, to post-industrial, and now largely a service society. That means almost all the things that we buy have foreign origins. Economics, from a capitalist perspective, is pretty straightforward. This is your classic supply-demand graph. If supply and demand meet at that point, it's called equilibrium, the price of the product will be reasonable. However, if the demand increases without an increase in supply, we're going to see an increase in the price of that product. There are fewer widgets and gadgets available compared to the demand for them. Generally speaking, according to capitalism and Adam Smith, there's an invisible hand that fixes this problem. Either the production will increase or new suppliers will join the market. And in so doing, that returns the point to equilibrium. No need for government intervention. The invisible hand is the rational self-interest of individuals and corporations, responding to market demands and opportunities. It is the beauty and the majesty of capitalism. Everyone pursues their own self-interest, and in so doing, every good and every service needed by society will be provided. We do have crises of supply and demand. We saw that beginning in early 2020, when suddenly everyone in the world needed a mask because of COVID. A shock to the international system that pushed the demand to an extreme, to the point that supply could never keep up. COVID and global pandemics have that sort of an impact on the supply and demand charts. So here is our crisis in 2020. There's an enormous demand for masks and other protective gear. The supply simply cannot keep up. Market forces alone do not allow us to generate the production needed to meet the needs of the American society, not to mention the world, when it comes to protective gear such as masks. Government intervention was needed. The government had to direct existing industries to begin to produce gloves, masks, gowns for those who are on the front line, and all sorts of other high-demand items on the market. Our supply chain crisis has many stress points. A large number of them are overseas. Simply put, overseas markets are having a difficult time keeping up with demand. Disruptions from the pandemic or other external events have caused disruptions in the supply chain. But even when products reach American shores, there are more supply chain stress points. Our ports of call are overwhelmed. From Jacksonville to Seattle, Los Angeles to Boston, we cannot find enough workers, and there doesn't seem to be enough time in the day to process all of the arriving international goods. And so those ships begin to pile up offshore, which of course costs money, and it raises the price of the goods. But even once they get inside the port system, we have a crisis of delivery in the United States. We are woefully understaffed in key industries, including transportation, such as trucking. Capitalism has a very simple answer for that. The market will correct this problem when truck drivers are paid a higher salary and better benefits, perhaps provided better job conditions. But to date, we've not been able to keep up with the decline in the number of truckers. So at all points in the system, from your local grocery store to the foreign point of origin, there are stress points in the global supply chain, and capitalism to date does not seem to be able to fix them all. Why do we have this crisis? A part of it, and I wouldn't say an overwhelming part of it, but certainly a portion of the reason is our relationship with China. Under the Trump administration, and continued into the Biden administration, we've been trying to disengage to some extent from China. We have placed tariffs on Chinese products, quotas on their imports, out of concern that China is not playing by the rules. It is cheating to get an advantage, and also out of a concern that many things that China produces are of critical importance for the United States, for our military, our automobile industry, our energy infrastructure. We're simply giving China too much leverage over the well-being of the United States. Some disentanglement of this trade relationship needs to happen. The global consumption surge that's been underway since the Cold War ended. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the rise of a truly global trading network, and with China's entry into it, many high-population countries have become wealthier. There's a very clear relationship between liberal economic policy, meaning capitalism, open markets, and free trade, and economic prosperity. With prosperity comes consumption, whether it's houses, Rolex watches, or any point in between. That surge places a lot of pressure on the global supply chain. Since COVID has begun to end, there's been a buying spree, especially in the Western world, but really globally, that has overwhelmed the supply chain industry. And finally, here in the United States, what is called the Great Resignation. For a host of reasons, Americans are not going back to work. When this lecture was taped in early November 2021, we were at an all-time high for Americans out of the workplace, by their own volition. Maybe they learned something because of COVID, that the stress just isn't worth it, that the rat race isn't paying off. For whatever reason, they're beginning to value staying at home, and millions of Americans are choosing to do exactly that. And if we're short in staff, it's very difficult to get products to the shelf and into the consumer's hands. For these reasons, we have a supply chain crisis in 2021 that's likely to still be ongoing as you watch this lecture. We now turn to economic philosophy, the policies that we choose in making our domestic and foreign policy. The most essential economic debate is between mercantilism on one end and free trade on the other. This is not a light switch. You're not really one or the other. Most countries are somewhere in between the gradations. China is a mercantilist nation. It maximizes its exports with a lot of government assistance, and it minimizes its imports with a lot of protection measures provided by Beijing. In so doing, China is able to accumulate a very large amount of money. It has a trade imbalance in its favor, exporting a great deal, importing very little. For every product that the U.S. sends to China, China sends 4 products to the United States. That means American dollars are piling up in China. It can use those dollars to subsidize its industries. It can also use them to build the global economic system that it's been working on for several years now. $1.54 trillion in the new Silk Road or Belt and Road Initiative. Japan since 1945 has acted like a mercantilist country. We have allowed Japan to do this. We've given it what we call infant market protections, allowing it to regenerate itself after the devastation of World War II, in the hopes that it would move from mercantilist towards a free trade approach. For the most part, Japan has not done that. For much of its first century in existence, the United States was also a mercantilist power. After World War II, we went all in on the free trade side, both for us and the international system. And as the leading state, the most impressive country after World War II, we were able to require nations to pursue free trade policies. That process began at Bretton Woods in 1944, when the United States met with its allies before the Second World War had even ended. And what we said to them was unlike the statement of any emerging hegemon in modern history. Normally, when a country becomes the dominant power, it takes territory and privileges away from the other powers. The United States of Bretton Woods did the exact opposite. We said to our allies, you'll keep your territory, we'll open our markets to you so that you can build your economies with the expectation that someday you will open your markets to us. It was a stunning development and one of the most important events of the 20th century. So how exactly does this free trade philosophy work? Here we have a number of nation states. Some of them are trading freely with one another. In so doing, they form an informal alliance of free trade nations, and they behave differently. Normally, countries that trade with each other do not go to war with each other. As nations on the outside begin to observe, see the accumulation of wealth among the free traders, the lack of war among them, it decides to join the group, to change its stripes, and to become a free trade nation. Conflicts that occur are largely between the free trade nations and the non-free trade, or fully outside of the free trade alliance. Those countries as well can realize that if they trade freely, adopt capitalist economic philosophies, they'll be more peaceful at home and also more prosperous as well. So by this point, almost the entire world is inside this free trade agreement. Two nations, as you can see, are refusing to play along. Those are mercantilist nations. And of course, they're not using free trade policies. They're the outliers in the system. Japan and China are the classic examples. What we have decided to do is to embrace them and to allow them to join the free trade network, even though they're behaving like mercantilist nations. This is a very big risk because they are greatly advantaged by their mercantilist policies, yet they have access to our economic markets. So how did China get here? I explained Japan earlier, post-World War II, allowed us to develop, we give them a lot of latitude. That's not the case in China. It begins with the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. Deng Xiaoping and other technocrats succeeded him and took a much more pragmatic view to economics. They created specialized economic zones along the coastline that functioned like free trade regions within a communist country. Cold War ended, global trade markets expanded, China was allowed into the World Trade Organization and given highly favorable terms of trade, under the assumption that by joining the WTO, it would adopt free trade policies. It clearly has not. As we look at the global supply chain today, China is at the center of many of the paths of production and shipment. And that translates into a great deal of leverage for the People's Republic of China. That is why industrial policy is a great decision. It affects our national security and economic well-being. One example of China's dominance and its leverage is that of rare earth elements. So these are elements, a dozen, two, maybe three of them, that are found in very low concentrations in the ground, but they're absolutely essential for all things electronic. They're a very valued commodity. China today produces 85% of the world's rare earth metals. And that means if it were to decide to boycott or simply consume them all, rather than shipping them abroad, our economic system would face a very severe shortage of many important supply items. So what explains this? Because 50 years ago, we were the dominant rare earth supplier to the world's markets. And over the course of these decades, it has absolutely collapsed. One reason is the environment. As noted earlier, low concentrations means you have to dig up a lot of dirt in order to find enough rare earth metals to be productive. We value our environment. Secondly, as seemingly as when we would decline in production, China would simply take our place, so the market provided the rare earth metals that we needed. and also a healthy dose of short-sightedness, not realizing how this momentum would build over time. China, on the other hand, has risen to the dominant level in rare earth metals. Governments have directed the population and industry to dig up and produce rare earth. The Chinese have purchased 3 third-party areas in other countries, and the Chinese have been playing the long game, seeking to develop leverage over the United States, over Japan, and over the Western world by dominating rare earth metals, and as you can see, they have succeeded. Having considered these 3 items, we now turn to U.S. foreign policy options. There are 3 of them: renewed engagement, decoupling of economies, or the adoption of a new industrial policy. What does renewed engagement mean? Well, we go back to the earlier graph. Global free trade network. Most countries are categorized as free traders, with the 2 obvious outliers. This strategy says keep doing what we're doing. Continue to trade in order to draw in the outliers, and hopefully they will change their color and one day open their markets to free and fair trade. Very few Americans have optimism that this will happen, and almost no one has the patience to wait long enough to see if it will. So the traditional American policy since 1945, create the global trading system, open your markets to foreign trade, and wait out all of the outliers, seems to have run its course. Even though China is a member of the World Trade Organization, it is not adopting the deep and free trade rules of the WTO. And as a result, it's pretty easy to conclude that renewed engagement simply will not work. It's also clear that the Biden administration has reached that conclusion because most of the previous Trump policies on China continue throughout 2021. Okay, how about another option, decoupling? This is a bit involved. Stage 1, we begin to shift supply chains to others, trying to avoid supply chains that run through China. Stage number 2, significant export restrictions on technology. It's already illegal to ship many high-tech items abroad, such as powerful computers. This would strengthen those rules and expand them to other areas where the Chinese may be copying our technology, mass producing it without all the R&D investment, and then making a profit on it. Stage 3, countervailing and anti-dumping duties. This means targeting China for its anti-free trade actions relative to its own domestic production. They're dumping when they're selling products below fair market value in order to run businesses out of the market. Then they can dominate that market. And finally, there's stage 4, restricting our foreign investments. These are corporate and private investments that are being sent to China, and restricting the number of Chinese FDIs that are allowed here in the United States. You can see why this second strategy is called decoupling. We're trying to disengage from the Chinese economy. With each and every one of these steps, there will be a counter-Chinese proposal. They will work to harm us for any problems we cause in their economic approach. Mr. Biden and Mr. Xi, you can see them there meeting, a summit-level event. A lot of issues on the table, highly unlikely that those 2 leaders will agree on either re-engagement or decoupling. Here you can see China's new Silk Road, Belt and Road Initiative, waterways, land routes across the international system and reaching deep into Europe. It appears that China is well on its way to creating its own supply chain. Our last policy option is an industrial policy. And this in and of itself doesn't tell us a lot because it really depends on how ambitious we're going to be. On the least ambitious side, well, we would target a few sectors, really important ones, and we would help those industries reconfigure. provide them with the incentives, the resources, the tax breaks, so they can upgrade their facilities and become more competitive with other countries. On the ambitious side is to fundamentally change the country's economic infrastructure. Either one of those will require a massive amount of government intervention, a very heavy hand in the economy, one that we have not seen in more than a century. Should we decide to be ambitious, we are going to move significantly down the path towards mercantilism. And while people can argue this is a short-term policy for a desperately needed fix, it is very difficult to move from left to right on this economic spectrum. Much easier to move from right to left. So we should take this with a grain of salt. The temptation of pouring money into key industries so that they can be competitive globally, knowing that that is going to abandon basic economic philosophies relating to capitalism. Three difficult choices, and that is why this is a great decision in 2022. We've now completed all 8 traditional great decisions topic. There is one bonus lecture that I'll ask you to stay tuned for. We'll look at the Biden foreign policy agenda. Until then, thank you for attending, stay engaged, and make great decisions.
Okay, thanks once again to Dr. Morton. I think he does a great job in these videos and provides a lot of good information. Excuse me, I've got a drippy nose. By the way, this is day 91 of Putin's war in Ukraine. Thought you might like to remember that. In preparing for this today, I watched more than 10 videos on the topic. Some of them were just a few minutes long, some over an hour. And I saw a lot that reconfirmed what Dr. Morton has told us, but I saw some new information as well. He defined industrial policy as government intervention. Another definition says that government picks winners and losers. That's another way to say the same thing, I guess. One of the speakers said, "That's wrong. Government never picks losers." That's not healthy for them to get reelected. Budgets and leadership are fragmented throughout the government, so it's hard to implement policy once it's decided. And then as he mentioned, there are stress points in the system, transportation and so forth. The Biden administration, I think, has been pretty successful in implementing their green policies. That's definitely picking a sector that, or a result that they're interested in, and a lot of different parts of government have responded to that, implemented policies within their sector that supports that. Another argument is that industrial policy is not needed, and as mentioned in the video, the market will determine, but there's unfair practices. China especially, as was mentioned, unfair competition from countries that do have industrial policies and who support their industries that create a problem for us. Our industries are having a hard time competing. Free markets worked until they didn't because of those protectionist policies primarily and the stress points. Were you surprised that Japan was included in that category of a protectionist country? We did experience that when we were stationed in Okinawa, Japan for a total of 5 years, over 3 different times, and we could see firsthand how they really did protect their own industries at the expense of ours. And just in time, as was mentioned, just in time philosophy worked until it didn't. The military has adopted this big time. When I was in logistics in Okinawa, Japan, as Charlie mentioned, it was hard to get parts a lot of times because of the long supply chain from the U.S. over there, and also because of interruptions in the system. We had to be careful about how we implemented, when and how we implemented that just-in-time philosophy. There was an advantage to it because you didn't have to spend so much money to keep inventory on the shelves. But there's also some potential problems you have to be aware of. Offshoring didn't work. Offshoring, we had a lot of companies who went to Mexico or the Far East to have their products made and to source parts for their products because it was cheaper and it was easier for them to make money if they offshored or what's the other word for that? They offshored or they outsourcing. Very good. That's the word I was looking for. Government agencies, including the military, also though had to abide by edicts to buy American, which was also mentioned. We had to buy American. That was one of the policies the government had in order to influence our buying from U.S. companies to help U.S. companies make a profit. Now the phrase is reshoring. We did offshoring for a while, now we're reshoring. And what really brought this to the fore is the medical crisis because of COVID, not being able to get the equipment that we needed. Excuse me, please. It's allergies. Nothing contagious. So, reshoring examples include the medical equipment and medicines. The government's doing a lot to try to get us to do more in that area. You hear a lot about the chips, the semiconductor chips are in the news. The semiconductor business in the U.S. decreased from 37% in 1990 to 12% today, 22 years later. So that's why we're having chip problems. There's a lot of pending legislation to try to correct the problem. There's too much pending legislation, in my humble opinion. I tried to look it up online, and it's just too hard to figure it all out. There's so many different pieces of legislation, and there's actually one that's trying to combine it all into one legislation. Automakers are now making fewer specialized chips. I know you've heard about how cars require all these special chips. They're going to more standardized semiconductors that can be programmed so they don't have to buy a special chip. I don't know if anybody's tried to buy a new or used car lately. Even the used cars that already have their chips have gone way up in price because the new cars are not that available. In fact, there's a board member of Mercedes who said that they will make sure they will have customizable, standardized chips in their cars from now on, not 1,000 different chips. Interestingly, for those of you who have iPhones and iPads, half of Apple's top 200 suppliers are in and around Shanghai. And we know that Shanghai's been under lockdown now for many weeks, so it's been hard for them to get their supplies. But it's not just chips. Tesla produced 1,500 cars in their Shanghai plant in April. That's compared to 65,000 in March. It was not because of chips. It was because of a lack of wiring harnesses. And of course now we're hearing about the baby formula problem. And that's not because of chips either. It's because they closed down one factory that happens to be the one that the U.S. is most dependent on for baby formula. I did hear on one video that the Department of Commerce is actually Congress has told the Department of Commerce to set up an office to take a look at all U.S. manufacturing and products to see where we have problems in the system, like a single point of failure, like the baby formula has been. And then see where gas, yeah, that's in there. So, but they need to come up with ways to solve the problem. So there are people who argue against doing industrial policy. They say the government generally is not knowledgeable enough about business to be able to do that. And then there's always the question of who decides. Who decides who gets the money or the help? Which industry, which businesses get the help, and based on what? And the Department of Commerce says that they're working on that as well, trying to come up with some good rules of the road. But politics does get in the way. Lobbyists and those who can afford to pay the lobbyists are the ones who win. They're the ones who go to Congress and say, we need this kind of legislation to help our business. And that may be at the cost of another business. So the industrial policy tools are both carrots and sticks, and Dr. Morton did mention some of those in the video. Tariffs on imports, loans, loan guarantees and grants, subsidies for infant industries. Many have worked, but the most publicized example of one that didn't was the solar panel company Cylinder. Do you remember that? During the Obama administration, it went bankrupt after receiving $535 million in federal loan guarantees. But sometimes government can pick the right one, sometimes not. The government could also lower certain corporate taxes. They could protect intellectual property rights. Intellectual property is information and ideas that companies come up with that make their products more valuable. And unfortunately, China has been stealing our intellectual property so that they can compete with our products and at a lower price. Increased export initiatives, we could come up with regulations and so forth that encourage companies to export products so that they can sell more and not just rely on U.S. customers. But regulations cut both ways. They can either help or hurt businesses, and in some cases they help some while hurting others. I wonder if you have also noticed the great decisions lectures that we have heard. All of them seem to talk about China. There's a theme there. China has had very sharp economic growth in the past 20 years. And the question was asked, is that because of they implemented industrial policy or because of the liberalization of their government? I don't think they've liberalized that much, and it sounds like they're now unliberalizing again. But I think it was a little bit of both for them to get all that growth in the last 20 years. Their GDP is now 18% of the global GDP. The U.S. is still larger at 24%. The EU as a whole is about the same at 17.8%. Most experts agree that China will continue to grow, but at a much slower rate. What some of the percent increase in GDP over the last 20 years, in some years was double digits. But just this April, China's industrial output is down 2.9% from March, just a month earlier. And also in April, their consumer spending is down 11.1% from March. And that's worse than their pre-pandemic levels. China has certain advantages, of course. They can direct their priorities and people will follow or suffer the consequences. And it can be consistent for many years. Xi Jinping has been in power now for many years and is expected to get another term of office when they have elections, quote unquote, elections by the Communist Party people in this fall. They have the numbers of people who can provide customers for the products. They have the protectionist policies, and they can direct top down, from top down, they can direct sharing across industries and sectors. U.S. has some advantages too. We have a track record and a reputation for innovation, and we have the politics that are favorable to innovation. And we have a much higher percentage of educated people in our country than China does. And we're low in some areas when you see the comparisons in math and science, but overall the numbers of people that we have are higher educated than those in China. And China has the infrastructure for, U.S. has an infrastructure for delivery and support. Sometimes it's stressed, but it's there. And I will tell you, when we drove to Nevada last November, there was a problem in one of the interstate highways where you had to go down to one lane, both sides, and there was truck after truck after truck, and I said, what truck driver shortage? They were all out there on that one interstate, it seemed to me. It did slow us down a bit. The bottom line, though, I think we can all agree, is that the world economy is very complex and intertwined. That makes it very difficult to come up with and implement a successful industrial policy. And it tends to change from one administration to another. So, do you have any questions or comments at this point?
When you have questions, raise your hand, and I will try to get the microphone to you in the order that you raise your hands. You need the microphone, for one thing, because of WCTY. So Robert has the first question.
Hello.
Hi, Robert.
I got two quick questions. Okay, now we now all this stuff going on. But like he said on the radio, okay. We not really done all. We not really done. No, we not really done.
We're not done?
Yes,
Okay.
we're not done.
Okay.
Because, you know why? Because now they're talking about coming back. It's coming back. But they don't know for sure. But they're looking at it, and I saw it on the tape yesterday when I went to my meeting. And we had a meeting yesterday, and they were talking about it's coming back. COVID might come back. And we all concerned about that. And because it is getting worse and worse and worse and worse down the hill. It's getting worse. So what I'm saying, the second question, and we don't know what to do. And all this stuff going on and everything, we don't know what to do. And I talked to a couple of people, they don't know what to do either. So if we get that thing coming back, and like he said on that radio, if you pay attention to it, you understand what he's saying. We probably getting it back. Now, if we get it back, we get in trouble.
Okay, I think both questions revolve around the fact that COVID is coming back, and what are we going to do about it, and that we don't know what to do about it. I think there are a lot of people who are a lot smarter about what to do about it now than we were 2 years ago when it first arrived, and I don't I'm not naive enough to think that it's not going to be a problem. It is going to be a problem, and we are all, I think, going to be a little bit tired of the lockdowns, the quarantines, the mask mandates, and all those things that we had to go through for 2 years. And so a lot of people aren't going to want to do that again. That may make it harder to take care of it this time around. So we are smarter than we were before, and hopefully we can have a better response to it, but that doesn't mean that people aren't going to die.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yes, Bernard?
Is it possible for the United States to be self-sufficient in productions?
Is it possible for the U.S. to be self-sufficient producing all that we need? I think not totally. We don't have all those rare earths. We have some, but not all of them, and those are needed for all the electronics, and we are very heavy into electronics these days. You know, we don't want to give up our phones, cell phones, or TVs, or anything like that. So, yes, we can be much more self-sufficient than we are today. And as I said, we're getting back into manufacturing. We are reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., but we still are going to be relying on products from outside the U.S., unfortunately. So hopefully we'll find sources for those products among countries that we can depend on. Yes, ma'am.
China has been experiencing a lockdown for quite some time.
It's not working. Let's see what it is here. Sorry.
I can maybe repeat it.
Anyway, China has been experiencing a lockdown, specifically in Shanghai.
Right.
And I've been watching videos of people who have been locked into their apartment complexes. They're not allowed to go out. They're bringing the food to them. They're testing daily. We aren't doing any of that here. I wonder how much of that is the government trying to control their population. Is it the COVID, or is it a control issue to keep people from going out?
Okay, thank you. The question is about Shanghai. I think many of you have seen on TV how they are in lockdown and have been for some time. They're not allowed to go out of their apartments at all. Food is being brought to them, etc. And the question is how much of that is because of COVID or because the government is just trying to control the population. And again, I think it's a little bit of both. It gives the government a good excuse to control the population. Although I think I have heard recently that they're starting to take some of the restrictions off around Shanghai.
Okay, we're out of batteries, and so we're no more questions. No, actually.
Out of time, yeah.
But I really appreciate your presentation, Carol.
Thank you.
Thanks.